As chairman of Schumacher, I'd like to welcome everyone here to our annual lecture program. And quickly, I wanted to get a sense for who's in the room. So I have a couple of questions. Who traveled more than 10 miles to come tonight?
Oh.
Gar. That's nice. Who's ever heard, met, spoken, or read Gar's book in the past? There's a lot of people here with something to learn. Who uses Berkshires at least once a week? Who's actively involved in the local economy? Proactively involved? Okay. Who spends a decent portion of their time thinking how we could do a little better? All right, we're all worried. Well, thank you. So it's my honor to introduce Gar Alperovitz, who's our speaker this evening. I'm a little bit new myself to the new economy space, and so I have special respect and appreciation for the people that have been forging the way, holding down the fort, clearing the tracks for decades. Gar, like Susan Witt, like others in the room. I kind of have a feeling that this issue is becoming more current and more relevant, but for years it was like my mom going on the first march against the Vietnam War when it was dangerous to march, and then it became cool to march. So we're hoping this will become a cool mainstream issue and we can get some things done. To me, Gar is very special within the new economy space, and principally because he's been uniquely productive and uniquely broad. So he started the Cleveland Project, which is a very local, tangible, raised money, started companies, doing the right thing with the right people. And then he's also a professor at Harvard and Cambridge and Brookings and now at Delaware, where he thinks deeply about what he's done and he talks about it. And also, he's kind of a movie star. He's been on every TV show, talk show you can imagine. He writes prolifically articles and so forth, and he's written several books. And I don't know, there's a lot of things in my life that are very impressive, but actually anyone can start a book, but finishing the thing is like a really, really big deal. So, and that's the topic of tonight's conversation, and Gar's book is What Then Must We Do? But the language is emerging new order as the old order decays. Those are some big words. And so it's just spectacularly wonderful to have Gar here and to be able to talk to him and learn from him. Tomorrow he's spending the day with 20 college and grad students going more deeply on the subject. He has time for it, he's passionate. And that's really, what gets me about Gar is, the most inspiring thing is his personal energy and his commitment. And the most impressive thing is the reach. It's just really hard to find someone that's done the local work and been the professor and written a book and can talk about the big picture. It's really a big deal. And I don't know, but the most interesting thing is there's a lot of people in our space that it's a very emotional thing that we're talking about, the new economy and local action and taking it back and how do we do it. Everything Gar does and everything he says is based in history. He's a historian. And so I take his books, I take his writings, I take his language extremely seriously because he doesn't utter a word that you can't stop him right there and go deep for the next hour and a half on the thing he just said. And so he's tackling the new economy from such an intellectually respectful, analytic, Harvard, Cambridge, Brookings place that he was a very powerful anchor. He's a powerful foundation in all the work that we're doing. So, Gar, thank you so much for coming here.
I probably should leave now because I can't live up to all that things Dan said. So thank you, Dan. Dan is wonderful. I've been participating in what we're going to talk about for a long time in a serious way. And I haven't finished a lot of books, Dan. I started some that I didn't finish. So, thank you for coming. I ask people at dinner, and as I usually do, they kind of look at me crazy when I do it. I say, well, what should I talk about? And it's kind of 20 minutes before the talk. And what I really mean is, who are you in the matter? And who are we? What is it that people actually really are concerned about? What are they doing? What might they do? What might we do? That's really the question I'm asking. And so I hear good things about you, and I know this community is one of the leaders in the country in developing very spectacular new directions that change the framework of discussion, sometimes small, sometimes big, sometimes very big, if you think about planting seeds that grow to oak trees. This is a big, you guys live in a big town, really big deal. And a lot of it due to Susan Witt and Bob Swan and the early work of the Schumacher Institute and Berkshire's and the Land Trust and the CSA, things that are now common around the country, got started in a place like this. So in the things I want to talk to you about today, one way to think about it is, how else does historical change ever begin? It usually begins with a few people. Margaret Mead famously said, "Never despair about small groups. It's the only way anything ever starts." Think about the kids who sat down in the civil rights movement. So in what I'm talking about and why I think it's important in this particular community that has done that and is continuing to do that, from what I learned at dinner and I've learned elsewhere, that's very important. But I don't want to let you off the hook. Since I'm in something that feels like a church, I get 2 minutes of sermon, or maybe 1 minute. One of the things I'd like you to think about is, what is it that you might possibly do as a result of hearing some guy give a lecture? Is there anything in it that I might take responsibility for? So I am talking to the person in your chair, and I'd like you to consider this not as a lecture, but as a question that you might ponder as to anything you might do that mattered as a result of coming, sitting, several people drove several miles. All right, so that's the beginning. I want to kind of talk to you about the difference between a political crisis and a systemic crisis, and why it's important to get that concept very clear. Most people, I don't think, realize that we are in the midst of a systemic crisis, the kind that cannot be changed easily by electing the next guy or gal, or electing the next politician or conservative or liberal or Republican, because it is anchored much more deeply in the foundational institutions of the entire society. And if you don't change those, however long it might take, you don't answer the problem. Now, that's a hard way to, that's a tough question, because people think, well, there's going to be a pendulum will swing, the problems in Washington will go away, or maybe we're in a difficult moment. We look back at the post-war boom, the civil, things do change. But I want to suggest to you that actually we are entering a period in our lifetimes when something much deeper is at work that has to be confronted first and thought about. Thinking is important in politics and changing order, and then thought about in terms of how might we proceed if we were serious about getting from here to there, and if we were practical about it. So I'm not going to give you a lot of statistics, but I ask you to bear with me just for about 2 minutes, because I've learned recently that some of these numbers begin to drill home the notion that there's something deeper at work that needs to be faced. So here, these are just some basic facts about what's going on in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years. No matter who's in office, you can elect Democrats and Republicans. Then, I don't know if Dan mentioned, I used to run House and staff committees. I ran staffs in the U.S. House and the Senate and the policy planning of the State Department. Been there, done that in real politics. And I'm suggesting that by and large, though there are important things to do, that's not where the action is. And the way you can tell is by looking at trends. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I'm saying that's not the big question. So over 30, 40 years, even 50 years in this case, corporate income tax receipts, this is about the power of corporations, have declined from 32% of federal revenues in 1952 to 15% in 1972 to 10% in 2000, now to 9.9% in 2012, last data. Steady decline in what the taxes are. If you look at corporate taxes as a measure of power, they have declined as a percent of GDP, 6% in 1952, 2.1% in 2000, 1.6%, a mere 1.6% in 2012. Steady decline in how much corporations pay taxes in the United States. For the last 3 decades, the income of the top 1% of individuals has increased from about 10% of all income to about 20%, which means that the bottom 99 lost that money, well, another indication of long trends. 3 decades, Democrats, Republicans, doesn't much matter. Over the last half century, marginal income tax rates for the top earners, think about this, have declined from 91% under Eisenhower in 1950 to 70% in 1980 to 39.6% for a reduced number in 2013 with bobbles in the Bush and Clinton and Obama era, starting out at 91, 70, and all the way down to less than 40. Meanwhile, these are measures of power as well as what's going on at a deeper level over time, no matter who's in office. Meanwhile, real wages adjusted for inflation, this is the one that's staggering, for 80% of American workers have hardly budged at all from 1973 to 2011. They have gone up, an average of 2 cents per hour per year. Another measure of the systemic nature, something deeper is going on. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, but most people don't know these data. At the same time all of this has gone on, the proportion of the U.S. population in federal and state prisons and jails, this is a measure of liberty, has increased from 93 per 100,000 to 743 per 100,000 over the last 43 years. This is a figure that is the highest in all of the Western world, Russia included, and more than 8 times higher than any Western European country per capita in your United States, land of liberty. But the long trend, again, is the thing to keep your eye on. Despite recent reductions attributable to the Great Recession, natural gas discoveries, U.S. output of CO2 and other global warming greenhouse gases has risen roughly 10% over the last 20 years. CO2 emissions alone are up 30%, the trend since 1970. And this is the one to really kind of think about. This is not a trend. This is a mere 400 people. You probably could squeeze them in this space if you tried, maybe just out a little bit into the anteroom. A mere 400 people, individuals, in the United States, this is a measure of power, have more wealth than the bottom 180 million Americans taken together. 400 people. And this is to say nothing of recessions and stagnation. Recessions in 1948, 49, 53, 54, 57, 58, 60, 61, 69, 70, 73, 75, 80, 81, 82, 90, and 91, 2001, 2007 to 2009. So what I'd like you to think about, what is producing those numbers in the long trends must be more deeply rooted in power and institutional relationships than just who gets elected. And I work with congressmen and senators. Now, these are the last, I'm going to give you one more paragraph or so of data, and then I'll stop boring you with these numbers. This is about your country and mine. These are UN data and OECD data. The United States now ranks lowest or close to lowest amongst the advanced affluent nations in connection with inequality, 21 out of 21, that's we are, last place. Poverty, 21 out of 21. Life expectancy, 21 out of 21. Infant mortality, 21 out of 21. Mental health, 19 out of 21. Obesity, 18 out of 18. Public spending on social programs as a percentage of GDP, 19 out of 21. Maternity leave, 21 out of 21. Paid annual leave, 20 out of 20. Maternal well-being, 20 out of 21. We have also 17th out of 21 in performance in math, We are 21 out of 21 on environment. We are the highest school dropout rate, 14 out of 16, almost the highest. It's 14 out of 16. The second highest per capita carbon dioxide emissions, second out of 21. The third highest ecological footprint, third out of 20. And just for the record, we have the worst score on the UN's Gender Inequality Index, gender inequality, 21 out of 21. One of the highest rates of failing to ratify international agreements, the highest military spending as a portion of GDP, first out of 21, and among the lowest spending on international development as a percentage of GDP. Those are pretty stark numbers. And they tell you that, as I said, that probably we need to probe much deeper into what is driving them and whether or not there's any way beyond the current elect the next guy. When you talk about systemic problems of this kind, and most scholars have pinned this down well and hard, I'll speak up. If you ask what is a system and what are the main characteristics that might produce these kinds of results, what defines a systemic crisis from a political crisis? Historically, the real basis of power has been wealth in one form or another. In the feudal era, it was land in places sort of that this is copied from, this building. And the lords and the king and the church who had the land had the political power. In communism or state socialism, the state had the wealth, and with it came political power. In American corporate capitalism, which is what we have, which is very different from 19th century entrepreneurial capitalism, but the dominant forces are corporations, there is a power position surrounding large corporations that's been well documented by many, many studies and that follows these data. So now you have a question. If wealth is in part, in large part, not entirely, the basis of the systemic trends you see, and if the one you've got here is producing these kinds of trends, and if you look at the Soviet Union, which was the only alternative, produced its trends, loss of democracy, ecological destruction, loss of liberty, either there is another way forward or there's no way forward. That's a nasty challenge to all of us. Either there is a different system somehow, some way, that doesn't look like corporate capitalism, it doesn't look like traditional state socialism. Either there is a new order, as the old order decays, that we happen to live in, or there's no way forward. That's a provocative statement, which we're going to talk about in question and answers. But that's the premise that I'm beginning with from after looking at these trends for a long time and staring them in the face, and I ask you to stare them in the face as well. They're not easy to look at. In a way, think about it this way. If you were in the late 18th century, say about 1750, democracy hadn't been invented. There were kings and colonial administrators reporting to kings and queens occasionally. And you said, we want democracy. We want a new order. And people would look at you and say, are you crazy? Letting people vote for how the society should be organized? That's crazy. The first revolution about that in the real first democracy with the United States. But note carefully, not people who didn't have wealth. Only people who had property, and not women, and not blacks. 4%. That was the way in which democracy, that was called democracy. And it revolved primarily around property because women were seen as property, as were slaves. Property is a big deal because it gives power to do things. So you might take as a hypothesis about the next system and where we might want to go at some point, that probably it would require some way to democratize the ownership of wealth and property, or you probably couldn't alter the trends if we know anything about the way systems work. Maybe. And I want to talk a lot about that, but I want to do a little footnote to this problem for some of the progressives in the room. Any progressives in the room? remember, I come out of liberalism. I'm a Wisconsin liberal. I ran House and Senate staffs for Wisconsin liberals. Some of you remember Gaylord Nelson, the great environmental senator, the founder of Earth Day. I was his legislative director. Been there, done that, that's where I come from, Racine, Wisconsin. That was called liberalism. You like the past tense? The way in which the system we thought we could organize, and which I was intimately part of, and which most of us probably still participate in one form or another, ran, was we thought in the face of these kinds of power relationships, we could organize sufficient political power to constrain and regulate and tax the corporations and the wealth, and use it for social programs or to preserve the environment or to take care of poverty. That was the model. Elect the new guy or gal, and in some parts of the country that actually still works, to alter trend. Keep your eye on the ball, not to just get elected and not to just pass a program. Can you alter those trends, or doesn't it matter over time? That model worked temporarily, I would suggest to you as a historian, for 3 reasons, all 3 of which are gone. And we are back to the power relationships that either have to be looked at and then transcended, or we don't get anywhere. So let me tell you at least my interpretation of the power relationships. One of them was, I'm going to use a funny phrase, we happened to have a Great Depression, and we happened to have a conservative Republican in the presidency. Imagine if a liberal Democrat were in the presidency when the Depression happened, and then there would have been a conservative elected rather than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We happened to get lucky. And in that Depression, because of the crisis, they were able to mobilize many things, including labor laws and Social Security, and out of a crisis moment, with luck that a Democrat was in power, we got the basis of the small welfare state that the United States have, by far the weakest in the world. And then, by luck, I use this word paradoxically, World War II happened. Not a very lucky thing, but it happened to build a huge, powerful government possibility. It strengthened the labor movement and built a base politically for labor unions to help, John Kenneth Galbraith used to say, countervail the political power of corporations. Labor went from 11% of the labor force organized in unions in 1929 to 26% organized in unions by 1939 because of the Depression and passing the Wagner Act and other things that made that possible, to 53.4% of the labor force in 1947 because of World War II and what was the power relationships. Labor was very important, and they got a lot of benefits out of World War II. Accidental events, retrospectively, that allowed the creation of a power base. Labor has always been the significant power base in all other advanced industrial countries to alter those trends and to countervail against corporations. In Sweden, it's 85% of the labor force. So what happens if that was just an accident passing in the night from a historical perspective? Labor has gone, absent those conditions, from its high of 53% to 54% in the 1950s. It's down now at 11% of the labor force, less than 6% in the private sector, and declining. That systemic design, watch that language, the design was the power is going to come with wealth and corporations, but we can build a politics, which is movement building, but at its core is an institution with power and money and organizational capacity called labor unions. Been well studied by political scientists, and virtually throughout the world, that is the basis of these numbers in most countries, because they are corporate capitalist countries, and they use this mechanism in some places better, in some places worse, to produce countervailing to alter the trends. And one of the reasons you see us at the bottom is we have a virtually implausible labor movement now. Lots of reasons for that. We could get into it, including race and size of the country. It's been well studied. But it faces you with this problem if you're serious about equality, poverty, ecological sustainability, and I'm going to argue climate change. Either the power relationships built into those numbers and these facts change, or you can't move forward. I don't know if you thought you were coming to a lecture about this, but this is what it's about and how it hits home and where it comes to in terms of what we can do and what is beginning to happen. There is an interesting thing happening in the country because out of the numbers you've seen and out of these relationships, people are beginning in many parts of the country, and this is what the new economy movement's about, and this is what we're discovering, and this is what I see in this town long before some of this happened. People are discovering either we begin to move in a new direction, the new order. Can you get yourself back to 1750? And those guys and gals who thought they could change the most powerful empire in the world? Little dinky colonies sprinkled up and down the East Coast against the most powerful empire in the world, we can overcome. In 50 years, that was a ridiculous idea. We may be, I'm suggesting to you, just possibly, just for tonight, allow yourself to imagine that we may have the possibility of laying the preliminary foundations of something that has a long-term capacity to produce the new order. Now, what do I mean by that? What I've been learning around the country, and the press doesn't report this, it's not interested, it doesn't have the money to do the reporting, and very often the people who own the newspapers locally have an interest against reporting this. There is something stirring out of the pain and difficulty at the local level, and partly out of vision coming out of the environmental movement. It's a double-barreled phenomenon. Partly out of a sense we must deal with climate change, we must deal with the future, we must deal with sustainability. That's part of it. The other part is either we find a new way forward, or the poverty and the violence and the inequality and the degradation that is occurring in community after community after community in this country. We've been working in Cleveland, in a city that was 900,000, it's now 300,000, in a neighborhood where 40% unemployment, 40, entirely black, average income 18,000, and people in desperation. Either there's a new way forward when just electing the next guy or gal doesn't alter the trend, and it is still important to do. I'm not knocking it in that sense. It's better to have something positive than nothing. Either there's a new way forward, or the trends get worse, and really up against that. And what people are looking at, surprisingly but interestingly, and if you think about it as a historian or a political analyst, what they're beginning to do out of necessity. And as they do it, they're teaching people around the country, you could do this too, they're beginning to build new institutions that help solve local problems, but also are characterized by democratizing the ownership of wealth. They are actually looking at getting to own the wealth, which may be the power base of the system, in a very democratic, very American way, piece by piece experimenting, and at an increasing pace now. That's beginning to build up around the country. You probably don't know much about it if you don't follow this as closely as some of us who spend time on this. It is building up. I just have been speaking around the country, and almost every place I go, 5 or 6 people come up to me and tell me about something's going on locally that I'd never heard about that has the characteristics I'm going to describe. And it is out of the pain and the frustration that either you do it in a different way, hard as that may be, or the problem gets worse. What I just said was a mechanism, a dynamic mechanism of historical dynamics. That wasn't just about what people are doing. If you stand back and look at it analytically, there is a dynamic process at work caused by pain and a dead end, which is forcing this. not just because people want to do it, though that's important as well, particularly in the environmental area. There's a consciousness change. So partly it is drawing on old models of democratizing wealth, which I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. Partly it's very American, and in that way very exciting, because we aren't like the French with a very top-down administrative structure, for instance, or even the Swedes. And partly it's coming out of new inventions. So let me talk about, just suggest to you what democratizing wealth means in concrete terms and what's going on around the country. Just for a start, most of you probably know, or maybe didn't know, that 140 million Americans are members of co-ops, garden variety form of democratizing ownership. There they are, 40% of the society involved in all kinds of old form co-ops, agricultural co-ops, electrical co-ops, hardware co-ops, very mundane, but they are both there and expanding in number and in characteristics. One of the most important forms, and here's part of the dynamic to keep your eye on. One of the most important forms is the garden variety credit union. Boring institution, really. It has more capital taken together than any of the big 5 banks in New York. It is a one-person, one-vote bank. You can go down and elect the board. Nobody ever goes to the annual meeting because it's so boring. Except the staff, who go because the president tells them to go and re-elect his board. Occupy people around the country have discovered this fact and are beginning to go to the annual meeting and elect different board members who have different priorities than the same old stuff, like building new co-ops in a different direction. Huge amount of capital. That's a little picture, micro, of democratizing ownership. Another picture, land trusts, which were very, very unconventional. One of the first ones in the country here. Another one in southwest Georgia and in Vermont. 30 or 40 years ago, when land trusts first began to be discussed, land trust is socializing land through a nonprofit corporation in order to control the prices so people can stay there, or some people tap the values in one part of the land trust, let housing go up, capture the money, use it to subsidize other things, instead of letting the real estate developers capture all the development costs, development gains from housing expansion. So that's a way to do it, or to preserve the land for agricultural or conservation purposes. Land trusts of that kind, there were none 40 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. I've got the dates just about 40 years. Susan will tell me if I'm wrong in the back. It's approximately 40 years. Then 2 or 3, and now they're all over the country because it is a positive way through democratizing ownership, people discovered, rather than letting the developer take it, to begin to counter the trends and produce low-income housing and control gentrification, and in some cases deal with environmental problems and land use problems of a different kind, beyond just costs. So in fact, it's gotten very inventive. I'm going to use a nasty word. There's a lot of socialism going on in the United States related to ownership of land. And here's how it goes. In big cities, Washington, D.C. is a good example, it used to be that there would be a huge public investment in subways. And then at each exit, the land values would explode. Those are great places to put high-rise apartments and stores and so forth. You make a lot of money if you can stand right next to the exit. And then you would run after the developer and try to tax back as much as you could, but he had all the power in the city council, so you couldn't get much of it back. That's old school. Many parts of the country have now owned the land around the development exits, put the public money in to build the subways or the metros, and then capture that directly, ownership of the means of production, land in this case, and cross-subsidizing that for public purposes, and not changing the ownership. It's democratizing ownership in another form. I'll give you another example. 2,000 public utilities, city ownership, now exist in the United States. City socialism, much of it in the South. They have 25% of American electricity now is distributed by public authorities and co-ops. Different forms of ownership, grassroots forms. There are many, many, many community development corporations, 5,000 of them in the country. Neighborhood ownership, some of it business development, some of it ownership, Some of it complex, some of it involving multi-million-dollar structures and hundreds of people owned in industries and businesses owned by the neighborhood nonprofit corporation, the profits of which get plowed back into services, directly capturing and democratizing ownership. And this is growing around the country and is not reported much. I'm not going to give you too many more of these, but I want to give you a sense of it. Social enterprises and B Corps are beginning to develop. How many know what a B Corps is? Okay, lots of you folks know. It's an attempt to set up a company which, when you buy into it, you know that they may distribute some of their profits for social purposes. And furthermore, they might, and this happened again, Ben and Jerry lost on this one, under corporate law, you are the board of directors is required and the executive officers under corporate law to take the highest bid if you're offered a buyout price. That's what happened to Ben and Jerry's, and they lost the company. A B Corp is set up legally at the outset going in, so that one, you don't have to do that if you have a higher social purpose, and you don't have to invest knowing that. And secondly, you can use some of your profits for social purposes. That's not full democratization. That's moving towards using wealth ownership for a public purpose or a social purpose, but not fully democratized. I can tell you a lot more going on at the local level, but it's exploding all over the country, and the main reason is necessity. It's being forced, either this or pain continues. So let that one sit there, because as the trends continue to deepen, that's part of the beginning, very importantly, democratic process. This is not Washington. This is local people finding new ways and building experience into their culture. And one of the things I've been learning about this town is there is a culture building up, not just the institutions, a set of ideas and a set of relationships out of which something else may come, because the paradigm begins to grow culturally as well as institutionally. There are also many things going on at the state level that are not reported. How many know about the State Bank of North Dakota? The State Bank, North Dakota, one of the most conservative states in the country, has had a socialist bank for 90 years. Now, I've used the word socialist just to tweak you. It is a government-owned bank that makes money for the state and has been acting there with the successful support of small business, co-ops, farmers, et cetera, for 90 years. The important point is it's been rediscovered. There are 20 states now looking at legislation to set up public banks, like the Bank of North Dakota. Many cities are looking at the fact they have huge tax revenues and they have to put it somewhere. Instead of putting it in the Wall Street banks or their branches, put it in a local bank or a credit union, or a new city bank is being looked at in several cities. Again, the thing to keep your eye on, these all are forms at the local level of experimentation with democratizing ownership, and at the state level. So I won't go further, and those of you who want to get into it, I want to give you a website which covers this, and then a lot of my book is reporting on tons of this stuff going on, and more, ask your friends when you go to another city, you will find people are doing this, because there's no alternative in many cases. Another thing that's going on, just to give you the flavor of it, and one way to think about it here again is to go back in the decades before the New Deal. In the decades before the New Deal, in the, quote, state and local laboratories of democracy, that was the language, people were developing things in states when the right time occurred, became the principles upon which national legislation occurred. A good deal of the New Deal was based on stuff that was done in my home state of Wisconsin. Labor laws, minimum wages, what looks like Social Security or public pensions. All that was experimented with at the state and local level. So if you think I'm suggesting to you that these little things I'm talking about may have ramifications if the pain levels continue and if there are no alternatives and the trends continue, it's exactly what I'm suggesting to you, the possibility that we are seeing new forms of development that don't look like the old forms and begin to democratize wealth, but also begin to build a political power base around a different paradigm. And that too is happening as we go forward. That's a bit of the vision that I want to suggest to you is happening at that level. But it's not the only thing, if you keep your eye on the ball, that's moving in exactly this same direction, but in a parallel track. Maybe you've noticed that we have a healthcare crisis. Some of you have, I'm sure. Probably everyone in this room has been thinking about Obamacare and the corporations. Under the current structure of ownership and control in the healthcare industry, mostly the private insurance companies, to a substantial degree hospital monopolization in many cities, and the drug companies, the United States now spends roughly 2 times the percentage of GDP on healthcare of any advanced nations, twice as much as a share of the economy. And our outcomes are at the bottom of the list. I just read you some of the data. Staggering. No business would allow that to happen. You know, here's what the numbers really mean. Twice as much as a share of GDP as any of the other advanced nations, roughly. If we were to do what the Canadians or the Swedes or the French or most countries by and large do and cut it in half, it's $1 trillion of waste a year. $1 trillion. We don't know what that means. It's a $16 to $17 trillion economy. That's a lot of money being thrown down the sewer in a system that is the worst producer of health outcomes in the advanced world. Well, Obamacare is beginning in the direction of trying to move in that. But what's happening in several states is that the next step as the problems occur is, will Obamacare lead, not nationally, but state by state by state, over time as the pain grows and the costs grow, towards something like single payer. Now, single payer, I don't like that term. That's the common term. Medicare is a single payer insurance company. Medicare is a public insurance company. That's what it is, all it is. A publicly owned insurance company called Medicare. That's what single payer is as well. But in many states, Vermont is going to do it next year, they're moving from Obamacare towards single payer. That's the clear direction. And another thing that's happening in many parts of the country is health co-ops are being set up to compete with insurance companies. Another form of democratic ownership coming out of not just ideas, but the pressure that's building up to do something intelligent and cost-effective, piece by piece by piece. Stand back with me. The prehistory of the New Deal was done this way. It doesn't mean inevitably we're shifting towards a society in which we're democratizing in a very decentralized way, but maybe so if the trends continue. And interesting things are happening in the way of innovation as well. So let me give you a sense of that. 30 years ago, I was involved in the state of Ohio. Ohio felt the pain levels we now feel 30 years before most of the country. So what's happened in the 30 years of Ohio may actually have more relevance to what's happening to us today. They've been there, done that, and they're beginning to look in new directions. 30 years ago, I was involved with the local steel workers in the city of Youngstown. I got a lot of press because I was doing things on economics in those days, so I was in television a lot, and they called me from Washington, would I come and help them do what? This is the first big steel closing in the United States in 1977. Youngstown Sheet and Tube went down. 5,000 people lost their job in one day. That was national news. Some of the older folks here will remember it. It was on the front page of every newspaper and led to television reports. Now it's so common nobody hears about it. But then it was a big deal. And the workers and the churches and the religious groups said, what are we going to do? And they came up with the idea we ought to set up a worker community-owned steel mill, take it over, and put it back to work. And then they did their politics. And they forced the Carter administration to support them with $100 million of loan guarantees. They also financed the study by the most advanced experts in the industry showing how to do it. And they began to move to build it. And then, after the election of 1978, not surprisingly, the big steel companies and the big international union, not the local, the international, got together and all of a sudden the money disappeared. They understood, however, and this is the point, that you might lose some. They were not foolish But they simultaneously launched a big educational campaign about this idea who they thought was an idea whose time might come. So in the state of Ohio, you'll find 500,000 people today in worker-owned companies and an institution that supports them with loans and technical assistance. So that happened out of that fight over 30 years. Think the prehistory of not only the New Deal, but of the women's movement. You know about the prehistory of the women's movement? 6 decades, state by state by state by state, until they got the vote. That's the kind of thing we're talking about, developing from the bottom up. And innovation. So in the city of Cleveland now, the idea of worker ownership is conventional. And in that neighborhood of 40,000 people with $18,000 average income and 40% unemployment, there is now a complex of worker-owned companies. The largest industrial-scale greenhouse in the country under worker ownership. Produces 3 million heads of lettuce a year under worker ownership, cooperative. A very large-scale solar installation company. A large industrial-scale laundry, the greenest in the country, third of the water, third of the heat, et cetera, et cetera. And linked together in a nonprofit corporation to build the community with some of the profits and with some of the funding to finance the development of other worker-owned companies as part of this community building complex. Not just worker-owned companies hanging out there, but a complex to build a whole new economic base and using some of the profits to help the community rather than to make a couple guys rich. Democratizing ownership. And a further innovation. The use in that community, 40,000, there are 3 big institutions. Case Western Reserve University, Cleveland Clinic, one of the most famous health institutions in the world, and one of the largest, and Case Western Reserve and University Hospital. Those are the 3 big institutions. This is true in most cities. And some can use the city government or other ways, or universities. They purchase in that neighborhood $3 billion, with a B, dollars in goods and services every year. That's plus their salaries and plus their construction, just what they buy. None of it from this neighborhood in which they exist. And they can't move. They're so-called anchor institutions. Well, the light bulb and the innovation trend, which is the thing to keep your eye on, not so much, the pattern is very interesting, but the innovative trend is much more interesting. They now buy a substantial amount of things from these worker-owned companies to help stabilize them and build up the neighborhood. Now, there are a lot of taxpayer dollars, Medicare, Medicaid, education money in those institutions, so there's a good reason to say, why don't we help build the community in a new way? And interestingly, this socialist idea, quote, quote, worker ownership of the means of production, I'm going to twist your tails, is supported by conservative businessmen in the state. Why? People are working hard, they get a piece of the action, they build up money for the community, it's good for the other businessmen, and it's practical. And we're seeing this particular model is exploding all over the country now. There's a huge one starting in the Bronx, we just announced yesterday. There's one in Atlanta, there's 3 in the Washington, D.C. area, there's one in Richmond, California, and there's one in Richmond, Virginia, developing in the developmental stage, another one exploring in Jacksonville. There's a big one starting in Atlanta, even in Amarillo, Texas, because it solves a problem by virtue not of trying to tax money that you can't tax because of the power relationships, directly capturing ownership and using directly those funds to support what's happening by democratizing ownership. And this is the interesting part, if you think in these historical development terms about where the new order might go, I use the word might, and I'll underline it and come back to it. I'm not a determinist, so I don't think anything's inevitable about this. If you think about it in those terms, it is really interesting because it suggests a paradigm that could have larger implications elsewhere. This is all grassroots stuff, local stuff. And in some communities also, like this one, which is not looking like Cleveland at all, you're seeing it for environmental reasons, things we discussed, but centering around a different way to control and own and manage property. At another level entirely, while this is going on, at the grassroots level, experimenting, teaching new principles, looking at new ways of doing things, slowly developing, it's called the New Economy Movement. As Dan was saying, this is so-called New Economy Movement. Next week is New Economy Week. You may see a lot of press about these kinds of experiments exploding, because there's an activist interest in this right now, and it's getting the paradigm, the language is beginning to develop. You are at the beginning of possibly the next civil rights movement. The new economy movement is exploding around the country, and the press hasn't yet quite caught it. At another level entirely, there are these problems going on in the healthcare industry which are not localized, but big pieces of the economy moving in ways that probably can only be solved by democratization. I mentioned health. The other obvious one in this area is banking. Virtually every expert I know, left, right, and center, who looks at the banking industry believes that the banking industry is up for another crisis, and probably another big one, and that you can't control it by regulation. Think about that. The bankers are too powerful to be regulated, in fact. And that's not me, that's an inside view of both Senate and for financial specialists who believe that to be true, because there are so many. I have a friend who I won't discuss with you the name, who was an insider in one of the big Wall Street firms and is now a banking regulator. And he describes how most of the people who are banking regulators sit across, who may make $180,000 max, sitting across from the guy who's, third, not even at the highest level of the big banks, who's making $1 million, easy, maybe $3 million. And the guy across from him is kind of negotiating what the regulation is going to look like when he puts the fine print down. And he says, to the Senate guy, or to the regulator, he says, the banker says, gosh, you know so much about this. Maybe at some point we ought to drink and have a drink. Maybe at some point you'd like to come work for us. Gosh, you know so much. The pressure, looking at those big numbers, quite apart from how complex it is, even when there's integrity, you probably can't regulate the big banks. Now, the current nostrum is, we'll break them up. They're too big to fail. Now, I'm for that. But anybody who knows anything about the history of breaking up big corporations, antitrust did it, knows what happens. AT&T and Standard Oil are the classic examples. You break them up, then the big fish eat the little fish, and you're back at the same place in another decade or two, because the process of merging and agglomeration is so powerful that they are back where they were. So breaking up doesn't work. I think we're going to actually come at this as the conservative founders of the Chicago School of Economics finally realized. You didn't think I was a conservative economist, probably. I have great admiration for serious conservatives. I don't mean the hacks and political rhetoric. I mean people who are thoughtful about conservative ideas, genuinely thoughtful. I may disagree, but there's a genuine argument to be made, and it's a decent argument. The founders of the Chicago School of Economics, the home of the most conservative economics in the United States, Milton Friedman's teachers, were interested in a competitive free market economy because they believed that was the basis of liberty and democracy. They were very serious and thoughtful about the relationship of institutions of ownership to democracy, which is what we're talking about. And they believed if you had a free enterprise, smaller scale or medium scale society that didn't allow agglomerations of power, you had a shot at building a democratic and a country supported of liberty and democracy. That's where they were genuinely coming from. I honor that. And then they saw that out of this process, giant corporations were growing that weren't like that. They were not interested in a free market. They were interested in controlling the market and dominating it, manipulating it. They knew that. They understood they were a threat to this vision of genuine conservative economics. And furthermore, they argued, this is Milton Friedman's teachers, not me, that if you tried to regulate them, they would capture the regulators. One of them got a Nobel Prize for developing the theory of regulation and the capture of regulators. Indeed did. Now, if you broke them up, they also saw they would regroup. This is conservative economics. And their answer was the only answer ultimately is going to be nationalize them. What? Because it's the only way to preserve a free market. They were at least willing to think institutionally in terms of power, and their argument, I think, will come to fruition at some point down the line with the big banks. because I don't think you can regulate them, and I don't think you can break them up in a way that will stay, and there will be more banking crises, and even the Tea Party hates them more than the left. And at some point, the logic is probably some of them get turned into public utilities down the line. 40% of banking in the world is already public. It's not very unusual to have public banks, and they're the ones that don't go under. So we may see that. Now I'm going to give you one last stretch in this direction down the line, because there's a bigger issue at stake here in this larger argument. One of the real problems that can't be regulated has to do with growth and climate change. Now, I am strongly in favor of the local efforts that are going on to green the economy, to deal with carbon emissions, to deal with the difficulties that are producing global warming. But we all know that there are large questions involved in terms of some of the big corporations, and particularly the oil companies. And if you can't regulate them, at some point, they will have to be public if you want to solve the problem. I think that's down the line. I think that's inevitably, that's the question. We may not be able to do that, but I don't think you conduct the logic of that at some of those levels. Now, by the way, you did notice that we did, by the way, nationalize General Motors, Chrysler, AIG, the biggest. You can nationalize companies in the United States when crises occur, and we may see that down the line as well for purposes of this kind. There's another question about global warming, which I want you to kind of, I want to ask you to kind of look at this one in the face, because think of Cleveland, think of Detroit, which lost 1 million people. Think of many, many cities like that. Corporations left Cleveland, they left Detroit, and moved to someplace else. Very common in the United States. Not so common in many countries. What that means is, when you go from 900,000 to 300,000 people, or from 3 million to 1 million, what that means is the houses, the roads, the schools, the hospitals, everything in the city, 2/3 of it is wasted at huge capital cost, at huge carbon costs, and then where all those people had to go someplace because the corporations moved, the jobs moved. Then you had to build all that up again at huge carbon capital costs as well. And the carbon impact is the one I think people need to look at. So if you want to deal with global warming, you're going to have to deal with that thing out there called the large corporation at some point. We may not be able to do that. But the logic of what I'm suggesting to you is there may at some point, as the pain deepens and as necessity forces, and as people, partly out of pain and partly out of a vision of a better society, out of climate change, out of environmental concerns, beginning to realize that either we probe much deeper to the institutional and systemic basis of the old order, or we lose, because the trends are going the way I suggested. And the power that used to be able to reverse them, in significant part based on an institution called labor, is gone. The mayor of Cleveland, Ohio, looks very good politically. Why? Because he's got a new institutional power base of the kind I was describing. And people are beginning to realize that not only are you democratizing ownership and beginning to deal with ecological problems, you may begin to build an institutional base with a different political implication. Now that's where it gets interesting. And I'm going to say just a little bit more about that, and then one other thing, and then I'll shut up and let you guys throw some questions at me. Building an institutional base for the next politics may be the only way ever to alter the trends and build a decent society that deals with the great American values like equality. The trends are down. Democracy, they control the action. Liberty, the numbers are pretty nasty, to say nothing of civil libertarians and what's going on when you control the courts. These are about American values at the heart of the system, not just about who you elect, but about the most important core values. Now, when that gets touched, when it actually gets inflamed, and when you get explosions of, like the feminist movement, the environmental movement, but also the civil rights movement, or the Middle East, or nobody predicted the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the collapse of apartheid. When you get an explosive possibility, then things get really interesting. Then it is very important to actually have some idea, is there a way to have democratic ownership, a different system that is democratized, localist, not centralized? Is there some model that we need to begin to talk about? And at that level too, it's very interesting if you kind of follow this around the country. What this kind of trend has been forcing people to begin to think about is, what does the next system look like? I mean, really, what does it look like? If you don't like socialism, state socialism, if you don't like corporate capitalism, you can't get small business, there may be nothing. There's, some we can talk about later if you want to, there's a couple projects going on, big scholars like the president of the Political Science Association, the president of the Sociology Association, the president of the Academy of Management, people beginning to say, what does it look like? Can we begin to use intelligence to begin to think through how do we meet the institutional structure of a different way forward that builds on some of what we're learning as the old order collapses? That's underway too at the level of ideas. That may be more important than much of this, because partly what people who think about the future lack is a sense that there might be a different possibility. Now, that's not present yet, but it's being generated and created, not just rhetoric. What does it look like? How does that work? It's like, go back to the 1750s. Democracy? What the hell is that? I don't know what that is. We got kings. I'm just twisting your tail a little bit. But the idea system also is in play. And people like us, I am again talking to the person in your seat, it is people like us who either begin to connect with this set of questions and struggle with it and chew on it and look to what you can do experimentally locally and maybe begin to talk about where we might go big time and open that up. That's how things get started and get going. There's no other way. So I propose to you that task. Here, do it. What do I mean by that? Chairman Mao had a wonderful phrase about this. Chairman Mao said, power grows out of the barrel of a gun. And the American women's movement, I'm a little older, I remember the women's movement when it really got roaring. There's some other women here I see nodding. They said, no, that's not how power gets built. The way you do it is you get half a dozen friends, and you get some pizza, and you read some books, and you find out what people are doing, and then you figure out what you could do here, and then you support each other. That's where power comes from. So I commend the American women's movement to you in this fight for the long democratization of the era and society, and I commend even more the wonderful experience of this particular community that's already been doing it and showing a leadership role in the United States of America. Thank you.
Welcome to Great Barrington.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
And I would say that I am much less of a progressive and much more of a radical revolutionary.
Hear, hear,
and will
hear,
be
hear.
one of those 5 people to come up and tell you some of the cool-ass magic we're creating here.
Uh-huh.
And I have the great privilege of playing with some extraordinary thought leaders in terms of the future of money. Uh-huh. And we are playing in what was called the generosity economy, what we're now calling, what was called the gift economy, now the generosity economy, and this is meta-currency and beyond money, of course, which brings into question how are we in deep intimacy, communion, trust with each other at a community level. So I'm very interested in what your thoughts are on this trans-monetization and how that can impact us. And then likewise, as a women's empowerment activist, I'm also interested, part of what we talk about and look at is the current pyramidical architecture of money and the slave-based, domination-based architecture that creates at a cultural level is part of the fruit of patriarchy. So what do you see as women's influence or power to really shift our whole global economic paradigm? 2 questions for you.
I'm not going to spend much time on the first question because I don't know enough about some of it and it's too technical. So I'm going to leave that out. Sorry. But I do want to pick up on the feminist argument. And I come from the perspective of people like Martin Buber. Anybody? Martin Buber? Yes. Okay. Pathways in Utopia, not just I and thou, but they're related. Which is that the reconstruction of culture is largely what is this all about. Although many feminists that wanting to change the relationship not only between men and women, but child rearing, for instance, and the culture of the community. You get in most communities, you get the woman under pressure and the guy under pressure, and there's no time for the kids. Let me give you an example of this. Let me give you a gritty example. My wife's a psychotherapist. She reported this story to me, a 10-year-old boy who comes home after school every day, talks into a tape recorder so that he can hear a human voice when he plays it back. That's the change in radical culture, depriving people of not only role models, but human warmth and time to be. The parents don't have any time. They're not squeezed. And that means there are cultural implications, not only for how we build a common community, like this one, but how we relate to each other. Now, part of the feminist movement has not gone to, all right, what does that mean? It means changing the ownership of power, like capital democratization. So they haven't dealt with that, but they've opened this door, and also the elderly, and how we treat, and people who are, how we have time, or to put it in a different form, each generation creates the basis of the next generation. You create the foundation, the people, the children. And the culture that we create either is a culture in common or a culture of the kind where that kid is so isolated and his parents are so driven, and been there, done that. So partly it is, how do we even think about stabilizing the basis of local communities, providing enough time and resources. You can't tax it back. There's no way to tax the money anymore because the power relationships don't allow it. Setting up forms of ownership that can produce funds, money, and beginning to develop the whole thing with a different perspective. But it does get back to who controls the power game, and that's a lot of it's about wealth. And the old models, socializing, doesn't work anymore. Is there an American, down-home American way? That's what this is all about. And this is emerging as a real question in many parts of the country. So I'm bringing news from other parts of the country to the 2 or 3 people who may not have heard about this. That's what I really think is critical in these larger sets of questions, the cultural matter. Because if you can't build a culture in common, you also can't develop, stop me because I'm going to use some academic, you can't develop the norms that then enforce the political process. So like equality. If you don't have a culture that's supportive of equality, a culture, not just power institutions, you can't do it politically. So you need both the power base, which has not always been talked about in feminist scholarship, and the cultural change. So there is a whole set of issues around community that is critical here. And in places like this place, I spent dinner with a number of people who were giving me the sense, we had one level at the conversation at the level of facts about what's going on. There was a whole other level of conversation that this community sees itself as a community of some kind. That's a whole different thing. And that's, in some ways, the most important. Sir, I think you were next.
From your wanderings around the country on this subject, do you find any examples of that give hope in the area of attacking the concentration of the misuse of resources in the most obvious area, defense? It's occurred to me that one area is this huge concentration we have of defense bases, which even Donald Rumsfeld wanted to close, and he can't get that past the military-industrial. He couldn't get that past the military-industrial complex. I think I read somewhere of one case, and I wonder whether it could be generalized, of developing local contests to turn bases into sustainability bases and seek to get federal defense revenues streams going to those bases. rechanneled into other uses.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Have you heard anything of that kind? Or?
I haven't. There are in many places around the country that are turning military bases into public uses when they are decommissioned. That's very common, but I hadn't heard the demand being built up that way. But I do want to suggest to you that the military budget, large as it is actually under pressure. People don't want to send their kids to Afghanistan anymore, and they don't want to send their kids to Iraq. There is a declining base, even for Obama to go bombing, which I hope he doesn't do, that everyone is against going into Syria. They don't want these wars. There's a developmental trend against this kind of, and the sequester movement cut a big piece of the military budget. Now, it is very large. It's the largest in the world. But as a share of GDP, and if you're a historian, you look at the trend, it's gone from 42% during World War II of the GDP, of the gross national product. And it's gone down to 14% of the Korean War, averaged 10% during the 1950s, 8.8% on average during the 60s, peaking in the Vietnam War, stayed hovering in the 6.7 range in the 70s and 80s, and moving now under the projection for the next 5 years to less than 3% of the GDP. It's very large, but it is failing because people don't want to send their kids, and I think we're going to see that go down. We will do horrible things, in my view, with drones and other things, but I suspect we may be moving towards less and less support for big tanks, which is what drones are, the whole war machinery. Let's put an end to that. As you probably know, I write about foreign policy a lot, so I'm on your side of this issue. But as a historian, it's going down. That doesn't mean it's down. That means there's a lot of work to do, but there is some hope in that. Ma'am.
The institution I want to talk about was agriculture.
Yes.
In this room are many of us who are young farmers who are struggling with democratizing access to land and the control of that land as a sustaining foundational base for a new economy. I wonder if you could reflect on some of the characteristics of the new strategies and solutions that we might look towards for inspiration on that front.
Look around you. This is the place that's really doing exciting work. I am not an expert, but I got a good briefing on the particular form in which the new land trust effort is beginning to develop in this area, which is a way to capture land and not get it into the market and allow it and make it available to young farmers and to achieve food security in your own area at the same time you're doing it in an ecologically intelligent way. The real problem is how do you get the land without, in this area, the explosion of inflationary prices. People want to use it for second homes and so forth. One of the ways you do that is through a land trust or something like a land trust. That's either a nonprofit corporation or a public corporation that controls the land price and allows for different use so that the farmers can buy it or use it, but then not inflate the prices. The complexity of how that's done is quite complex, but also very well developed, the technology, how to do it. And people are doing it here in probably the most advanced way. So where's the person who knows all about land trusts here? Please raise your hand. Susan is way in back. You want to know? This is one of the places where, way in back, the greatest innovation on this front is happening in the country, just as it's happened with the new forms of money. And that's what can be done locally, and you will see this model explode once it's refined and developed. There's a whole new development going on in that, and it's very exciting.
I wanted to ask you briefly about controlling healthcare costs. You mentioned $1 trillion, you mentioned Medicare. Having just hit Medicare, I don't think there's any savings going on. It seems like the costs are not being controlled. I don't see any difference I don't see prices going down. That's my question.
Well, I think that to a certain degree that's true, but in systems where the whole system has been controlled through a public insurance company, to Medicare, the Canadian system, for instance, when you have the whole control of the whole system, they've been able to reduce administrative costs by 32% by just cutting out all the paperwork. My wife was in London about a year ago, and she slipped and fell and almost broke her hip. And someone took her to the public health, to the hospital, and they gave her services, x-rays, not only x-rays, but complex, fancy, I don't even know the terms of what the kind of advanced electronic kind of testing of the bone testing. And all of that, no paperwork and no cost. Zero. And then send her home with the crutches to America. The price, it's been demonstrated, if you can get control of the whole system, rather than pieces of it, you can in fact cut costs. The projections on Medicare are to cut costs 5 or 6% over the next 10 years, not 10 years, next 3 years anyway. So it's a complex answer, but there's a lot of literature on it showing how you can do it if you can manage all the parts. The problem is you can't manage all the parts now. One question over here.
Hi. My question is, broadly speaking, about language. All of your arguments that you make about how power is rooted in wealth, the statistical arguments about lowering the position of the working class, none of these are new arguments. All of these things have been observed about capitalism long ago by Karl Marx. Like, Marx is underlying everything that you say, but his name is never directly invoked. It's not something, Marx is not someone that you can talk about. You talk about the need of building a political movement around this new paradigm and the development of a language. You talk about the new economy movement. And I'm wondering, is that the language that we're going to build a movement around? Why are we afraid to invoke Marx? Why must we dance around the hated word socialism? I come from a new generation that was born after the fall of the Soviet Union. We don't remember McCarthy. People my age have no reason to fear the word socialism. Do we need to continue to dance around it in this way? Do we have to build a movement around, a disparate movement around these vague terms like Occupy or the new economy or radical democracy? Or is it worth going back to these old ideas and saying that we're talking about Marxism?
I like the cut of your jib. No, I mean, I like the spirit of the question. I mean, I may disagree, but I like the spirit of raising the tough question.
I was wary about the danger of orthodoxy as the next guy.
Excuse me?
Obviously. I'm wary of the danger of orthodoxy as the next guy, but the Tea Party has a very clear language. They're very well organized.
Well, the Marxist language, I have great respect for the Marxist tradition. But the Marxist language led to a series of ideas that produced the Soviet Union. And there is something wrong with the Marxist formula. So he was pointing to the power of capital, but so was every populist. Marx had a theory of, someone I was talking to an economist at Amherst recently. He said he was the first great theorist of unemployment. He was talking about crisis, economic crises, and so forth. Marx is a brilliant analyst, and he was interested in something. At some point, if you go to, we're going to talk a little Marxism right now, folks. As a respect, at some points, Marx was interested in decentralization. If you read what he wrote about the Paris Commune, which is a community of workers in a city, not a centralized state, you will find it's a different Marx than the Marxists who wrote about became Stalinists. So there is a Marx and a Marx and a Marx. Marx also thought the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands, maybe. He said maybe about the Netherlands. But the United States and Britain would evolve slowly towards what he called socialism. The central argument was some form of democratized ownership, but in the Marxist tradition, it ended up state socialism. Marxism itself in the United States is going through another revolution, talking about worker ownership. And it's become so hot on worker ownership that it's producing worker capitalists. That is to say, every little firm, think about this, worker ownership is not necessarily the obvious answer. Every little firm competing with each other has got to pollute, because the next guy will. Worker ownership under the current forms of Marxism. So I'm very leery of using the word Marxism because I think it's a phony language to talk about concretely what does it look like. I want to see if the Cleveland model is a good one, or Mondragon. People know about Mondragon, the famous the complex structure of co-ops and ownership in the Basque country of Spain. 85,000, very, very interesting, very sophisticated, and also very hot right now. So that language of socialism obscures the precise question of what the hell is your design? And the language also obscures all the different positions that have come up under socialism, and most important of which is the state socialist model. So yes, common or democratic ownership, plus in most visions of this kind, a lot of free enterprise, because we need innovators. So I'm away from that language for that reason. I think it obscures more than it takes, even though I respect the Marxist tradition. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that most people simply haven't paid attention to in the Marxist tradition. And finally, to affirm exactly what he said about the new generation, because you all know this, he's right. The latest poll data on people under 30 shows a slightly greater preference for the word socialism than the word capitalism. 3 polls lately. So he's absolutely right in terms of the language. But I think it's obscurative language. It gets fuzzy. It doesn't allow you to talk, okay, what does it mean here in this community? And do we really want that model or not? That's my objection to it. But thanks for the question. I agree with it. That's the end. Thank you.